Now, the idea that adding species or taking away species from an ecosystem will impact the way the ecosystem functions. That idea is something that seems evident. But we still need to think about which species are going to be important and how they're likely to impact ecosystem processes, because species abundance is changing for a number of reasons, including on our very own actions. Here, we're just going to go over an overview of species effects on ecosystem processes. Now, the authors state that no single species can perform all of the functional roles of organisms within a trophic level of an ecosystem. The statement that's made here is essentially an abstraction to get across the idea that diverse communities function differently than low diversity or single species communities. So it's definitely possible to have a community within an ecosystem that is composed of just one species. We have monocultures all the time within agronomic systems. So agricultural ecosystems, for example, we might plant a given ecosystem to just one species, such as corn. And for a given period of time, that ecosystem can function. It can cycle nutrients, it can gain and lose water, it can take up energy and photosynthesize. That part is true. But that system functions differently than a more diverse system. And even on these ecosystems, although it's a monoculture at one point in time, we often do rotation, so we'll add in additional species and cycle through them over time, such that at any one point it might be a monoculture, but over a longer time period, there's actually multiple species that are going to be present. That being said, the idea of a diverse ecosystem functioning differently than a low diversity or monoculture system is what's important here. And species differ in important traits that can't necessarily be represented in just one species. Now, this is just going to be a short departure from the way that the chapter is structured. As you read the chapter, you'll see that part of the chapter is based on separating species into effect and response types. And essentially what that means is that we can think of species as differing in how they affect ecosystems or how they respond to different perturbations. This is a classification or a division that I've felt is not that helpful. It's important to think about effects and responses, but actually saying that we can divide species up into effect and response types is something that hasn't been shown yet. So it might be helpful in some ways to structure thinking, but it's not something I'm going to cover here. The question that we had earlier is which species are most likely to have a strong impact on how an ecosystem functions. And the authors state that species are most likely to have strong ecosystem effects when they alter the interactive controls that directly regulate ecosystem processes. So this is one of the figures that I showed for representing interactive controls and state factors. And again, our state factors were on the outside. Here's the regional species pool, the potential biota of Yenny's state factors, and then we have species composition, which was an interactive control. When species composition impacts resource availability, microclimate, or disturbance in a large way and fundamentally or categorically alters those factors, that's when we're going to see the biggest effect on ecosystem processes. So if we have a species that fundamentally alters nutrient availability and is able to bring in or make available resources that weren't available by other plants, that's going to have a really big impact on ecosystem processes. If another species comes in, or we lose a species that has a big effect on microclimate, or disturbance, such as the example that we had with bufflegrass in the Sonoran Desert, that really ends up altering the ecosystem processes. So when we think about species and really how they can affect ecosystems, we think about how they impact disturbance, microclimate, or resource availability. Again, state factors are large controls on an ecosystem, but all of those arrows point inwards. There's no way for species composition to really affect the parent material of a landscape, or, for example, the macroclimate. In this section, I'm just going to go over a few of the terms that we're going to use in the rest of the chapter. The first is biodiversity, and essentially this is a catch-all phrase to represent the range of differences among species that we have at multiple different levels. So biological diversity that's present in a system includes genetic diversity within populations, species diversity at a higher level, and then even the diversity of ecosystems on a landscape. So that's a generic term, and there's lots of different definitions that are used with the term biodiversity, but we're just going to use it to represent the range of different species that we have, as well as the diversity that we have within species. So species diversity is a large component of biodiversity, as well as genetic diversity, and that can even be extended to diversity of ecosystems and communities at a higher level. So for ecosystems, when we talk about diversity and biodiversity, we often abstract species into something that's a little bit more meaningful for thinking about how ecosystems function. So here, when we think about diversity, we're going to think about functional diversity. We're going to think about the sum of biological traits of all the species in an ecosystem. But it's not just enough often to think about the presence of species, but also to think about their abundance on the landscape. So if we have a couple species, A and B, and they have a trait, but one species is more abundant than another, so it might make up 90% and the other 10%. When we think about the functioning of the ecosystem, we often weight their abundance, or weight the traits and the impacts that a trait will have on an ecosystem process by its abundance. So the authors will talk about functional diversity, and knowing that functional diversity, we want to know what the range of diversity is, but also to weight those characteristics by their abundance in the ecosystem. Another term that we're going to use is functional traits. And functional traits are characteristics of an individual or individual organism that impacts their fitness through effects on growth, reproduction, or survival. So what we want to do is know that we have 100 species in an ecosystem, and we can weight whatever factor we think is important by their abundance on the landscape. So something that's more abundant is more likely to have a big impact than a species that is less abundant. But the characteristics that we care about is not just their name and what other species that they're related to, but instead the characteristics that they have that ultimately impact ecosystem functioning. And so when we use the term functional trait, we're really thinking about those traits that are most important for growth, reproduction, and survival. So there's lots of different traits, and to a certain degree, all traits are likely to be important for growth, reproduction, and survival, but some traits are going to be more important than others. And we're going to go through some of those traits in the later part of the chapter. Earlier, we had talked about photosynthetic rates in plants, for example, as being important in nitrogen concentrations. Other characteristics, such as their ability to make nutrients available, and the symbioses or interactions with other plant species. So we're talking about the traits that we think are most important for how that ecosystem functions. The idea of diversity and its impact on ecosystem function has been a topic of study for a long time, but really in an experimental sense for only on the order of 20 years at the most. What this figure shows is really the relationships that we would have between the richness of species, so the number of species, and an ecosystem process. So panel A shows the effect of species number. Here's the effect of species abundance and the effect of species type. This first panel shows the relationship between species richness and ecosystem process. But what it does is contrast some of the differences that might exist among species and the shape of the curve that we get. So if we think about a monoculture, for example, of just one species, it might have a certain trait. But then what happens to a given ecosystem process, such as productivity, if we add the second species? Is it going to be lower or relatively higher? And then we add a third and a fourth. Does it increase relatively linear or level off? And in general, what we find is that adding additional species can increase something like productivity, but each additional species often increases productivity by a smaller amount than the previous species. So the idea is that some species are ecologically similar to other species, and adding those additional species, because of overlap in how they function and the functional traits that are present, we don't get a linear increase in the ecosystem process. it has a saturating relationship like this. The second panel says what happens if we start to remove species from an ecosystem. So again, the functional traits that are present in an ecosystem, we tend to weight by their abundance. If we remove rare species, this will have a lot less of effect than if we remove the dominant species. And that's all that this panel is starting to say, is that when we think about that process, we're going to weight the process by the relative abundance of a species. And removing a dominant species, at least in the short term, is going to have a much larger effect than rare species. Lastly, independent of its abundance on the landscape, what happens if we remove a species for which there's a lot of redundancy in the ecosystem, or these keystone species that have a big impact on interactive factors, for example. So if we remove keystone species, we're going to have a large ecosystem effect, whereas the removal of one species of a given functional type allows other species that have similar functional characteristics to increase in abundance, and we'll see compensation. So if there's 10 different species that all more or less have the same set of traits, removing one of them, regardless of their abundance, is not going to have a long-term impact on that system because other species are going to step up and perform that same function. Yet for a keystone species that's really functionally unique, if we remove that species, we're going to see a large impact on the ecosystem process. So keystone species is an important term to remember too in thinking about species that have unique characteristics and unique impacts on ecosystem processes. So another term to memorize and that we'll use later on too are keystone species. Now, often instead of each species is going to be unique, and that much we recognize, but it's helpful to abstract those species into categories, and we consider these to be functional types. And functional types are just groups of species that hold more or less similar sets of traits. And remember that talking about functional types, that's a categorical representation. And in many systems, if you remember, if we're taking a look at something like nitrogen concentrations and photosynthetic rates, that there are species that are evenly distributed along this general line that we have there. But we can do a continuous classification of species and represent them based on their actual nitrogen concentrations and photosynthetic rates, or often we might just do a categorical representation and talk about low nitrogen species and high nitrogen species. So if we talk about functional types, essentially what we're doing is we're abstracting the community into categories and ignoring some of the variation that occurs within that system, but it's a helpful abstraction just to talk about different types of species, although they may be arrayed continuously along a function and differ in other functional characteristics within that category.